Recently, two fairly important people in the free software world wrote articles speaking out against the FSF, those being Ariadne Connell of Alpine Linux and Leo Rowe of Libre. And both these articles focused on the way the FSF approaches firmware binary blobs and how this approach has a massive contradiction and is hypocritical compared to the rest of the software you may run on your system. So you may know the FSF has a certification called Respects Your Freedom, otherwise written as RYF. Now, what this means, or at least what you think it means, is that device is running 100% free software, because that's what it says here. All the product software must be free software. The product software includes all software that the seller includes in the product, provides with the product, recommends for use in conjunction with the product, and steers users towards installation in the product. Now, product software is problem number 1. Problem number 2 is, however, there is one exception for secondary embedded processors. The exception applies to software delivered inside auxiliary and low-level processors and FPGAs within which software installation is not intended after the user obtains the product. This can include, for instance, microcode inside a processor, firmware built into an I/O device, or the gate pattern of an FPGA. The software in such secondary processors does not count as product software. It should be noted that this secondary embedded processor exception only applies if there is not a free software alternative for the software that would be launched by that secondary processor. Now, this distinction between product software running on the main CPU, software the user can control, delete, modify, reverse engineer, all that fun stuff, and software running on a secondary processor that is very likely written into ROM is basically complete nonsense. Software is just software, and the FSF should never be marking a device as a respects your freedom device unless it is running 100% free software. So all of those ThinkPads that are marked as RYF devices are not respect your freedom devices if you actually want it to be running 100% free software. If for nothing else, just the CPU microcode. But because of this distinction, it leads to the FSF recommending things which in many cases lead to broken configurations, and in other cases are just frankly dangerous. So the kernel recommended by the FSF is the Linux Libre kernel. I do not think you should ever run this kernel. So what this does is it takes the regular Linux kernel and it basically gets rid of all of the proprietary blobs. It doesn't just disable them, it straight up rips out the code from the codebase. And depending on the hardware you're running, this leads to varying levels of broken configuration, because a lot of the company-backed device drivers, those are proprietary, and if you remove those, well, you're not using that device, now are you? But where it becomes actually dangerous to use it is when there is a CPU exploit. So a couple of years back, there were two exploits known as Spectre and Meltdown. The specific details which don't really matter for this video, but put together they affected basically all modern Intel and AMD CPUs. And the way you would actually address this is by installing new CPU microcode. Now, the code on your CPU is written into ROM. So you're not actually installing it onto the CPU, you're actually loading up this microcode every time your system boots. And obviously that microcode is being loaded up by the main CPU. Now, as you might be able to expect, both Intel and AMD use proprietary microcode. But back in 2018, this change was made to Linux Libre. Another significant change in this release is that it was pointed out that there were error messages in Linux suggesting users update x86 microcode. Since such microcode is non-free software, such messages don't belong in GNU Linux Libre. We now have patterns to detect and clean up this sort of message. A number of them were introduced recently relying on microcode changes to mitigate Spectre and Meltdown problems, but there might be others that go back farther. I haven't yet made my mind on whether to go back, check, and possibly respin such earlier releases. This is not a good change. This is actively putting your users in danger. Those error messages are there to tell you that your CPU is broken. The problem here is the microcode burnt into the mask ROM on the CPU. That isn't product software, so that doesn't really matter in the question of whether it's free software, but installing this new microcode, because this is running on the main CPU, now it is product software and it shouldn't be run. While this wasn't the case back in the 80s and the 90s, due to the complexity of modern CPUs, every single CPU that you buy is broken in some way or another. So you either have a broken CPU with the microcode it ships with, or a less broken CPU with the updated microcode. Now, Ariadne argues that Linux Libre restricts user freedom by disallowing these microcode updates, leaving the system vulnerable to Spectre, Meltdown, and all other CPU vulnerabilities that came out after your CPU was released. And while this is true in the case of being forced to use Linux Libre, you also have the freedom to not use it and pretend like it just doesn't exist. And honestly, as I mentioned, I think that's what you should do. There is also a misconception of what microcode can actually do on an x86 CPU from companies like AMD or Intel, thinking that changing the microcode makes the CPU act like an FPGA. So an FPGA is a field programmable gate array. Basically, it's a CPU that doesn't use fixed paths, and everything can be reprogrammed. So you can go and make all of these custom sort of CPU layouts on an FPGA. Now, I don't have confirmation of this being the case, but according to Leo Rowe, Stallman actually expressed this being his opinion on what microcode is actually capable of doing. The issue with this, though, is that not all of the x86 instructions are actually controlled by the microcode. There is some hardwired circuitry, and code isn't going to modify the circuitry. Also, microcode updates are volatile and must always be applied on boot. Now, due to the weirdness of the Respect Your Freedom certification, but the value it has among hardcore free software guys, some companies like, for example, Librem, have adopted really esoteric system architecture designs to try to actually meet it. So the Librem 5 has 2 CPUs. Librem is very open about doing this, and they're open about why they've done this, but it has a main CPU, the one you're going to use for your general computing, and a service CPU. So the service CPU is just a secondary CPU. What it does is it loads up the binary blobs like the DDR4 firmware, it turns on the main CPU, and then turns off. The reason why it does this is because now the main CPU never needs to touch those binary blobs, and it can try to get a Respect Your Freedom certification. The problem, though, is that even with this really stupid setup, it never actually got the certification, so all of that engineering for nothing, I guess. While Librem was open about it, and you actually can get rid of many of those blobs, there's no reason why the user needs to know about it. You can actually just have these blobs running in the background, have them started by a secondary CPU, and it's good. It's respecting your freedom because it's not being loaded by the main CPU, it's only being done on this secondary one. So if we break this idea down to its absolute core, if we ship a device with firmware burnt into ROM and loaded by a secondary CPU, that device can be RYF certified, but if we ship a device with firmware loaded in flash memory, then that device can't be. This is identical firmware, it is by the same vendor, all the hardware is exactly the same, the only difference is how the firmware is being loaded. Now, I would argue that if you need to have the microcode for your CPU, you need to have the CPU's embedded controller, you need to have the firmware for your hard drive or SSD. It is much more freedom respecting for the user to actually know that it is there, so that if they want to, they can reverse engineer it, they can modify it, they can replace it, or if they really want to, they can try to remove it. Rather than doing what's happening now, which is pretending like that software, oh, it doesn't matter. That's not product software, that's not software for the user to modify. It's fine that that's not free software. It's much better to acknowledge it so the FSF can actually educate people on that software being there, and you can make better choices about the software and hardware that you actually want to be using. Now, I don't have a confirmed reason why the FSF and the RYF certification are like this, but I think a likely reason is if the FSF didn't have this definitional constraint on why some software doesn't matter, there wouldn't be a single certified RYF laptop or RYF computer or anything like that in the entire world. There actually was someone who tried to build a laptop from scratch that actually would be RYF certified. They decided to not go with the certification because it required disabling the Wi-Fi and the GPU, which is not really viable if you want to actually have a functional device. But as for all of those RYF certified ThinkPads that are shipped with Libre that people on G like to talk about, they're not running 100% free software. They have proprietary microcode, and it's just not a concern of the FSF. Now, I'm going to leave both articles in the description down below. So Ariadne's is the FSF's relationship with firmware is harmful to free software users, and then Libre's is binary blob extermination policy, and the primary important part is everything after this point. I'll also leave a link to a Twitter thread where Hector Martin was talking about basically the same thing back when Librem was doing their esoteric system design. Currently, there seems to be a generational shift happening in the free software world, and it's not getting less extreme as you might expect, it's actually getting more extreme. They want more free software and want less of a pretending like some software doesn't actually matter. So that's going to be it for me, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I didn't know this was a thing until I read these articles and spent a couple of hours actually digging into all of this, and I felt like a lot of people really needed to know about this, because I think there is a lot of people out there who haven't heard about this either. So if you like this video, remember to go and like the video, and if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe, bearer pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech of a Tea, which I'm sure as hell going to be talking about this sometime soon. I've got my gaming channel, Brodie Robertson Plays. That's going to be it for me, so I'm out.